My background is actually in historic building surveying in the Netherlands. Before moving to the UK in 2006, I actually worked for a company in the Netherlands that specialised in, basically went out and surveyed historic buildings in Limburg, province of Limburg, where I'm from, near Maastricht. And one of the things I already got really acquainted with was not just the surveying, but also the sourcing of historic building materials, because it is one thing recommending people like what they need to use, but actually a lot of these historic building products aren't available anymore, or they weren't. I'm talking 25 years ago now. And so we already start sourcing products like lime washes, clay plasters, linseed paint. So when I moved to the UK, I first set up a company called Histoglass, and we worked on, oh gosh, anything from royal palaces to up to down in Yorkshire anywhere, and anything in between. And I did that for 18 years. And my route to market has always been to present to architects and specifiers and specialists in the industry. And every time I gave a presentation about the glazing, people are asking me like, "Well, Michiel, with your background and knowledge, what do you recommend we should use for paint?" And I just said like, "Well, of course you need to use linseed paint." And instead of like an affirmative nod, I was kind of met with like a bit of a blank stare. I was like, "Oh God, but even the specialists are not aware of this product." And I was like, "Okay, I need to do something about this, because this is too big a product to be ignored. You can get everything else right about your specification, but if you actually then paint it with the wrong paint, all the hard work that goes before is completely undone." People don't realize it's like the surface area of a building is enormous, and it has a huge impact on the overall health and well-being of not just the property, but also the people living in it. Yorkshire is, I mean, I could not have picked a better place to move to for various reasons, mostly the people, but also in terms of the product. Yorkshire has such a rich history in flax growing and making products derived from flax seed. So yeah, it just kind of, it was a perfect full circle. It was serendipity. Everything just came together to really have a really strong foundation for just reintroducing the product to the market. And that's what I did. So we found a local farmer who grows the flax seed and presses it for us. And then with that raw oil, we then turn that into linseed paint. What we've actually found is that it's not just the UK that has this rich history in this product. Actually, across the kind of climatic and soil bands across kind of northern Europe and then into the northern parts of the US and a lot of Canada has the same growing conditions. So we've seen a big resurgence, again, research about historic research that I did for the book actually showed that, again, it has a really rich history. So we automatically started to go really into, supplying it for the US. And it's interesting. I get a lot of questions about, especially from Europeans, and like, "Oh, but why do you do so much in the US?" And there's this misconception that the US doesn't have historic buildings. It really does. Building stock from the mid-1600s onwards, which is still considered old even over here. 90% of that is basically the same historic building stock that we have here. So there's no reason why we shouldn't use it. In fact, in the US, it's probably even more important because there's so much timber-clad properties which are starting to rot because of the paint that's being put on. So the US and both the UK have such a rich history in flax growing and basically producing all kinds of materials deriving from the flax plant. What we end up with is actually the raw linseed oil after we press it. We're only interested, obviously, when you look at the flax plant in the seeds. They're pressed using a cold press technique because that gives the highest yield in terms of quality, not in terms of quantity. And like anything, is the higher quality your ingredients and the raw materials, and then with good application, the longer your lifespan of the finished, project is going to be like. So raw linseed oil is not actually suitable for turning into paint, because even though it is classified as a drying oil, it dries really very slowly, really too slowly to turn into a paint. So really what we then do is we take the raw oil and we boil it. And then you can actually see that the color changes slightly. I still go back to a method that was used for hundreds of years. So we just boil the oil. This is what you get. And what you actually do is you change the carbon links of the oil, which does two things. It changes the viscosity. So all of a sudden it's just a little bit thicker than the raw linseed oil, which makes it really good for grinding pigments into. But also the change in carbon links then make it so that you actually get a drying oil, which dries more quickly because it changes the polymerization. That's about as technical as this gets. So one of the main aims with making a good quality linseed oil paint is to make sure that the ingredients are of the highest possible quality. One of the really underestimated and I think often overlooked aspects of linseed oil is having an understanding of where the protection comes from that linseed paint provides, basically any paint. And that is to have an understanding of the pigments that get used. So we use only powder pigments, original powder pigments, raw earth as much as possible, wherever possible. So with the raw earth pigments, you have to think about yellow ochres, iron oxides, umbers. Again, it's basically we're digging out the pigments. It's just soil, and that's what we ground into the linseed oil. Those are the ingredients of the paint. Now, with that, it is really important not just to have the highest quality pigment, but then the way the pigment is then dispersed and mixed into the oil, that is crucial. Because what you're really aiming for is the point at which each individual grain of the pigment is completely enveloped in the boiled linseed oil. Now, you can only really achieve that by doing a really good triple roller mill process. It's not good enough to just pour a bag of pigments into some boiled linseed oil and stir it really well. To the naked eye, that looks absolutely fine. But if you were to look at that under a microscope, and actually you don't even need to use a microscope, you can use just a good magnifying glass, you will see that the pigments are still kind of clumped together within the oil. Now, as you can imagine, if you start painting with that, if it doesn't disperse properly and you don't have complete even coverage, your lifespan is not going to be as good because the protection from the paint comes from the pigments. So you need to have those completely evenly spread out. UV light is the biggest culprit, or offers like the greatest attack on any kind of surface, and the protection in linseed paint comes from the pigments because they provide protection against UV light breaking it down. It's not really the oil itself. The oil itself is there to carry the pigments into the substrate, so into the paint, into the timber and into the metal. Once that's there, those pigments are not going to move. Now, it is essential over time to make sure that any kind of oil that breaks down on the surface, to make sure that you give that a good wipe and good maintenance with boiled linseed oil. And basically all you're doing is putting back what was there originally. So we're not introducing anything new. All you're doing is kind of nourishing that surface. Because linseed paint doesn't crack, doesn't peel. All that happens is because of that UV light breaking down the oil on the surface, it goes matte over time. So this is completely normal, and the paint still works absolutely fine, but a lot of people might not like that or prefer a higher sheen level, a higher gloss level. All you need to do is then just give it a wipe with a bit of boiled linseed oil. All different pigments, because they are raw earth pigments predominantly, they all have different properties as well. So if I take, for instance, an umber, a brown umber, which predominantly comes from the south of France and Italy, The raw umber actually has a really good drying capacity once it's dispersed in oil, because that's the other thing to remember is not every pigment works in linseed oil. So some pigments that work absolutely fine in a water-based paint, like a casein distemper or a glue distemper. So for instance, an indigo, which works really well in a water-based medium, really does not work in linseed oil. So it's about having an understanding of all these different pigments and how they work in linseed oil, and which properties they have. Like I mentioned, like a brown umber has really good strong drying properties. So you can play around with this as to which pigments that you combine. So we've already done the hard work for you here. So we've combined all of these. We've mixed them into a finished color card, which are all based on colors that I've essentially curated over the last 25 years. Another thing I do is building surveying, and yeah, I've surveyed, for instance, the windows on St. Paul's Cathedral chapter house, where you could see the blackout paint still on the actual window reveals. And again, it's that kind of really visceral connection to, in this case, fairly recent history. But I decided to pay homage to that and introduce our color blackout, which is the blackest, darkest linseed paint that you can make. So yeah, there are loads of different options and variations in pigments, and how you can then combine those, because you have to have an understanding how they all kind of interact and how they communicate. You can't just throw every pigment together. You have to have an understanding of how they work together. And then when you get that right, and you combine all these different things like experience on historic buildings, using the right really high quality ingredients with production methods, and then explain to people how to use the paint and apply the paint really well, that will give us the opportunity to really go forwards and really just reintroduce this product that was around for hundreds of years, and we should be using it again.